Chapter 40. The conversation with Ashley never happened that night. Instead, it had ended up waiting until the next morning. "What do you think I should do?" he asked after explaining his thoughts to her. She nodded slowly. "I think you should start training right away, if possible. I'll stay here with Dad until the meeting, I think, and help him prepare. Maybe start going to the gun range myself when I have time," she said with a wink. "I would like it if you were here on the day of the meeting though, just in case. With how much effort they have put into manipulating everything so far, I doubt the Arabs have gone through all their plans already." "That's a good point. You need to prepare everything with the assumption that you will face problems at the board meeting. That means when you two win, there will be more attacks either on you and your father or directed towards the company, and possibly even the research information specifically." After his discussion with Ashley, Rip felt better about moving forward with his plans and immediately began putting them into motion. He was waiting on calls from all the various agencies to truly get things started. However, he could get the ball moving on, locating a workshop and finding an old Airstream RV to work on. He had been keeping all his tools in the back of his work truck for so long that it would be nice to change things up a little. Finding the Airstream was easy, as there were a lot of them online to choose from. People used and abused the things, and then after a certain point simply stopped taking care of them. The main issue he found was that even when they were obviously falling apart and filled with rusty holes, the owners still seemed to think they were worth their weight in gold. He had no patience for such delusional people. Rip was not paying for a brand name product, not when it was in that state. The maker of the product meant absolutely nothing when everything, or at least 80% of the RV, had to be retrofitted anyway. Yes, he was looking for a project, but that didn't mean he had lost his mind. Regardless, he did eventually find one that fit what he wanted. He still paid too much for it, but not nearly as much as a lot of the other delusional people were asking for their wrecks. With that taken care of, he just needed to find a workshop close to their apartment. One that he could, with any luck, sign a deal on that day. Finding something like that was going to be a miracle, especially since he needed to do it while driving to pick up the Airstream trailer. The RV was a couple of hours away from Max's house, in the opposite direction of their apartment. By the time he pulled into their apartment complex, it was well into the afternoon, and he had gotten almost nowhere in the search for a workshop. However, he had received calls from all the different agencies, and they had agreed on a training process for him. It would officially start after the board meeting, a request that he had made. In the meantime, there were a few locations nearby where he could undergo shorter training sessions. If he wanted to carry in the US, he would still need to be certified through the usual methods. Granted, the programs would be accelerated, but he was definitely interested in completing them. When he wasn't looking for a workshop, that was what he would be doing for the next few days. In the meantime, the apartment complex would only let him keep the Airstream in the parking lot for a couple of days without hassling him. Any longer than that, and they would start giving him grief. Once he was back at the apartment, he was able to start making more concentrated calls to places around the area. With his laptop in front of him and a browser open, he was quickly able to make a dozen different calls. He wasn't looking for a commercial space, which helped to keep the prices low, but also affected the availability. However, it also meant that the people he was trying to call typically didn't mind that normal work hours were over. As a result, by the time dinner rolled around, he had found a workshop. It was a fully converted barn, set up on an older couple's property, about 20 minutes from the apartment. So while not right next door, the travel time wasn't terrible either. Regardless, the price was right and they seemed nice. Plus, they wouldn't be going to check on what he was doing at all. He would have the sole key to the workshop. If they were to be believed, that is. In the morning, he would take the Airstream over with his truck and tools. Then he would start going through all the certifications he could manage to get. The next morning saw Rip up bright and early as he moved the Airstream to its new home. The paperwork took only a couple of minutes, but the old couple's method of vetting him through in-person conversation took far longer. An hour and a full meal later, they finally handed him the keys to the workshop. It had its own driveway, and had apparently once been a second barn for the property from when it used to be a proper farm. They had no use for it, but also didn't want to tear it down or start selling off pieces of their property. The land was undoubtedly valuable, however, they weren't desperate enough for money to do that just yet. The farm had been in the family for generations, and they wanted to keep it that way for a little longer. Renting out the converted barn-turned-workshop was one of the ways they were managing to do that. As long as no one pried into what he was doing in the workshop, then he didn't care how they rented out the rest of their land. That said, he would be putting up security to ensure that none of his items were disturbed. Though he would have done that regardless, it had simply gone to the top of his to-do list now. Rip took a few minutes to back the Airstream into the workshop, and then transfer all his tools from the truck. With both tasks completed, he took a few minutes to look over the rest of the shop before locking the place up. With that all done, it was time to get some of his certifications in. Or failing that, to see where he needed to practice so he could get them. Chapter 41. The first stop Rip made was at a facility that did firearms training for the FBI. Their requirements were fairly easy, as long as you remained calm. They also typically only carried 3 different guns, each an agency standard model. They were a sidearm, a shotgun, and then a carbine. Obviously, he would be carrying his own models, but for the sake of the test, he would use theirs. Mainly because he didn't actually have any guns of his own yet. That was one of the next items to do on his list. It would involve him getting in touch with one of the local plumbers and seeing what they had in stock. When he got there, he was quickly run through the different qualifications he could take at that location. They wouldn't be wasting any time with classes for him, just pure range time. Rip wasn't going to be part of some task force where specialized knowledge was required, nor was he going to be sent on typical jobs. All of that, combined with his rather special upbringing as a child soldier, meant they were fast-tracking him straight past many of the normal processes. Besides, the agencies in question understood that most of these certifications were merely a formality in case he was ever stopped by an officer at the wrong time. They helped create a paper trail for legitimacy of sorts, and prevented people in the agencies from being called every 5 seconds. In other words, none of this was strictly speaking needed, but it would help out if he ever got in trouble. He was willing to put in the effort to prevent any issues from rising up in the future. It was silly not to in this case, when it was simple to go through the certification tests. The range time would also help him to shake off some more of the accumulated rust of his years living as a civilian. A part of him was even looking forward to doing these tests. He wanted to know how he stacked up against people who had been properly trained. In his opinion, he had not done that well on the ferry when he had been forced to go up against the 2 agents. At each certification, he would be able to get a glimpse of how he actually fared against professionals. It would give him an idea of what he really needed to focus his training on when it started after the board meeting. At least that was the hope. The reality of how they tested him was different from what he imagined. There was only a certain time he needed to beat, and a specified number of targets that needed to be hit for each qualification. There were of course other objectives, like how tight his groupings were, the various positions he needed to shoot from, and more. But that was it. They kept him completely separate from the other people at the facility. There were no scores that he could see, and if there were, they didn't apply to him. He was there on a simply pass or fail basis. He passed all of them. It was several days later that things began to pick up speed for them again. Rip had been in contact with the local plumber and gotten his hands on a few guns, both for himself and Ashley. So they were finally armed again, and both felt a little more in control and safe as a result. At least until Ashley returned from helping her father and told him that the Arabs had arrived. There were still 2 days to go until the board meeting. As soon as they arrived, they started making waves at the company. They weren't content to wait until the board meeting before making their outrageous demands. Instead, as soon as they had landed, they had started to make their presence known. They wanted access to areas of the company that they weren't cleared for. Demands had also been made to see top-secret information on projects that had yet to be revealed. They might have been shareholders, but that didn't mean they had any reason to know about those projects. The biggest problem, though, lay with who they had brought with them. Part of their guard detail included the soldiers that Ashley and Rip had encountered in Indonesia. The ones that had broken into their hotel room and then left a bomb in their belongings. Needless to say, Ashley was less than enthused to have any interactions with the group. That didn't stop them from seeking her out on the first day they were there. They didn't do anything to her, they didn't need to. The unspoken threat was there and plenty in this case. Unfortunately for them, they miscalculated just how angry their actions in Indonesia, and now again in America, had made Rip. He was a man who was likely barely on their radar, someone who was a curiosity, and little more. A person who had done everything in his power to get his girlfriend to safety. Sure, they had heard Rip mention that he was a child soldier, but it was obvious that hadn't penetrated into their thick skulls. If it had, they never would have come here in person. When Rip saw how shaken Ashley was that first night, he began preparing to conduct some urban warfare. The first thing he did was ensure that she was still wearing the armored shirt each day. The next was ensuring that she was constantly carrying the knife he had gotten her. He had gotten her a pistol as well, but she refused to carry it until she was far more familiar with shooting it at the range. It was a decision that he partially approved of and also disliked it. However, it was her choice, not his to make. After she had finally settled down and fallen asleep, he went to work. As shareholders who had come in for the board meeting, the company had the location of their accommodations on file. So finding out where they were staying was easy. With that knowledge in hand, Rip began using everything at his disposal to gather information on them. He had been busy the last few days when he wasn't working on his certifications, and Rip was more than ready to start monitoring them. It turned out that the local plumber had access to some fun toys that he could use in this situation. That was discounting the obvious other resources and information-gathering personnel that she brought to the table. Using the stealthy drone to watch them outside their hotel room was simultaneously fun and a little creepy for him. It really drove home just how much the world had changed, even from when he was a kid. The adults in the terrorist group would have quite literally killed for tech like this back then, and now anyone could simply buy it online. Granted, the blades keeping it aloft were special, and the cameras had a night vision mode. That was really it. Outside of a couple of modifications, the drone was completely stock. Flying it wasn't hard either, at least not for something basic like this. He wouldn't be doing anything complicated, but guiding it around undetected in the night was certainly within his capabilities. By the time he went to sleep hours later, Rip had the beginnings of a plan forming in the back of his mind. The next morning, he sent Ashley off with instructions on what to do if they approached her again. Her main job was to keep an eye on them and to, of course, stay safe. What he was going to be doing would be somewhat dangerous, at least it would be if he was caught. Otherwise, it would be like taking a stroll in the park. All he would be doing was paying a visit to their unoccupied hotel room. He wasn't even worried about whether or not they knew he had been there afterward. They had started this fight, and he would be careful to leave no directly incriminating traces. But he would make sure they knew someone had been in the room, looking through everything. He wanted to see how they reacted when they discovered the room had been compromised. He had equipment in his bag, specifically to make sure that he could find where any hidden cameras might have been placed in the suite. It wasn't a perfect plan, it was rather slapdash and terrible if he was being honest. Which was why he had a rolled-up duffel bag in his backpack. Every single piece of equipment he could find would be getting stuffed inside it. Rip was going to go full-on loot goblin this time around. Every gun, laptop, phone, paper, and everything he could fit inside the duffel would be taken. They couldn't connect to any cameras he might have missed, if they didn't have any devices to do it with after all. Chapter 42. Rip had already contacted the local cleaning crew, and they would erase him from all footage that the hotel gathered. That meant that he could walk in confidently and go straight to the elevators. Getting up to the top floor where their suite was required a special key normally. It was a similar situation to the one he had found himself in on the island in Indonesia. The main difference this time around was that he was prepared for that eventuality. One of the special items he had gotten from the plumber was a code injector card. All he needed to do was slip it into the reader and activate the program. There was no skill needed on his part. A few seconds after walking into the hotel elevator, he was on his way up to the top floor. There were only a couple of penthouse suites on the top floor. Luckily, Rip already knew where to go. Using the same card trick as he had with the elevator, he swiftly gained access to the empty suite. Once he was inside, he quickly started rifling through everything. The pitiful hotel safe was promptly cracked using the hotel's own backdoor code, and everything inside was stuffed inside his duffel bag. It didn't contain anything super special, unfortunately. There was a tablet, a few papers, and other miscellaneous items. No laptop though, which was the item he had been hoping for the most. The tablet wasn't bad, but laptops were far more versatile. No one with any brains would truly trust the safe in their hotel room with anything actually valuable. Leaving the door to the safe open, he continued looking through everything in the suite. Nothing was left unopened, unturned, or safe from his questing hands. As a result, he found a few items in places that people wouldn't have normally thought to look. In hotel rooms, the dressers and nightstands tended to be secured to the floor in some fashion. That meant there was a gap between the bottom drawer and the floor. Usually, it was covered by a floor panel of some sort. But such a flimsy panel was easy enough to remove. Underneath the bottom drawers of both nightstands and the dressers, he found a few more items. Rip left the drawers on the bed in plain sight and continued tearing the place apart. He wasn't interested in cataloging what he had gotten yet. That would come later. All he was interested in right then was covering as much of the place as possible, as quickly as possible. While he should have several hours of uninterrupted time to go through the place, he wasn't willing to count on that, and wanted to be out of there in under an hour. A time limit that he was quickly approaching. He had gone through every spot he could think of, and managed to nab a few cameras, along with other items. By that point, his duffel bag was beginning to bulge at the seams, and he decided that it was time to go. Rip headed for the elevators, and as soon as he was out of the building, he sent off a message to the cleaning team. They would work their magic and ensure he was removed from any and all cameras inside the hotel and nearby. Once he was inside his truck, Rip stuffed the entire duffel bag into a Faraday bag. It was something that would cut off any outside signals and communications. The bag was simply another layer of safety, just in case there was something that would have allowed the Arabs to track them. With that in mind, instead of heading to his apartment, which was several hours away, or even the workshop, he went to an empty parking lot. He hopped into the backseat of the extended cab, and quickly began going through everything. The electronics he left inside the bag, while pulling out everything else. There were documents, piles of cash, a few guns, knives, tasers, brass knuckles, and just random sheafs of paper for him to sort through. He had come away from the place with a lot of goodies, and was glad that he hadn't bought more weapons from the plumber just yet. He would need to make a few modifications to each of the guns, of course, before he could use them. There was no telling what sort of crimes they could have been used in by the previous owners. That meant he would need to change their firing patterns. Thankfully, that wasn't hard, simply time-consuming, as he would need to do it on each one. Just in case they had any hidden surprises, Rip took the time to take apart each of the guns and eject the ammunition from the magazine. He didn't find anything, but he was still glad that he had taken the time to do it. Putting everything back together, he stored them in the compartment under the rear seat. With those out of the way, he began looking through the papers. Some of them were in English, but they were in the minority. The bulk was written in Arabic, which he couldn't read. However, the camera app on his phone had done a passable job with it the last time around. Unfortunately, from what he was able to see, none of the pages had anything interesting on them. They were all about the company, the area, and just general information bios on each of the people who were on the board. It was a little curious that they felt the need to have them, but also not considering what they had already done. The papers were a bust. Having more cash was a nice bonus though. He stuffed the useless papers into the bottom of his duffel bag and reached for the Faraday bag. Each item was given a quick once-over and then thrust back inside after being turned off. He had no skill with cracking passwords or anything of the like. If they had been unlocked, then he certainly would have snooped through everything. He had taken them more to cause problems than anything else. That said, he would certainly hang on to them. Maybe in the future, if he got to know someone with that skill set, then he could pass them off and see what they could dig up. He could have used the Underworld for this, and they would have accepted the job. The problem there was that the Arabs also had access to the Underworld. What he had been doing so far was within the rules and been fairly low-key. If they started using the Underworld to come after him as well, then sides would be drawn, and the Arabs would have a lot more money than he did. However, the Underworld was typically leery of working directly with government entities. Giving them the occasional piece of information was fine, but directly offering their services to them was forbidden. Getting around that was a simple matter generally, as they would still help individual agents, at least to a certain extent. Really though, what kind of proper agent or operative needed to depend on the Underworld instead of their own government? Perhaps to escape when things went really wrong, but they would never do so in the middle of an operation. There was the possibility that too many details could leak out if they risked doing something like that. Not that those were a concern in this case. Thankfully, he had already accomplished the main objective of his mission. All he really needed to do was scare them, or at least make them back away from Ashley. He would find out the next day if he had been successful in that regard when he went in to work with her. They would likely figure at that point that it was him who had snuck into their room. If they hadn't managed to figure it out beforehand through other methods already. The point of erasing him from the cameras was to make sure they couldn't pursue legal action against him. It wasn't to make sure they were unable to figure out who had snuck in. That would be impossible, especially considering there was little doubt that he would be at the top of any list. Ensuring that the Faraday bag was properly closed, he stuffed it into the duffel bag. Moving around to the driver's seat, Rip started up the truck and left the empty parking lot behind. There was still a little time before Ashley and her father, Max, were scheduled to get back from work. He might as well get some groceries and start cooking a nice dinner at Max's house while he waited for them to return. Tomorrow would be stressful for everyone. It would be nice if they could relax tonight. Chapter 43. Ashley and Max looked a little less harried that night when they returned from work. The rest of the board had made appearances throughout the day as they arrived, and their presence had kept everyone else in line. The board meeting was scheduled to begin the next morning at 10 o'clock sharp. Rip planned on being right there in the building with them. He wouldn't be allowed in the room of the actual meeting, only the members of the board were allowed inside. Instead, he would be waiting nearby the entire time, watching, and waiting for someone to make a move against them. It wasn't that he wanted something to happen. But if Ashley and her father succeeded in their plan to maintain control of the company, then he could all but guarantee that something would. As with any board meeting, however, there was never just one item on the docket they needed to cover. This meant that there were several scheduled breaks, and with how involved the discussions would be, the entire affair would likely take all day. These people were helping to decide the direction of the whole company, and few took those decisions lightly. The doors shut behind them, and the meeting began on time. Each time they came out for one of their short breaks, Ashley or Max would give Rip a short update on the situation. The Arabs had been playing nice up to that point, but it was also clear that they were on edge. Something that he could personally attest to. The lead soldier from back in their hotel room in Indonesia, who was now serving as the lead guard, had been glaring at Rip non-stop all morning. Obviously, they had an idea of who had broken into their hotel suite. They weren't doing anything about it yet. That would change, regardless of the meeting's outcome, and Rip couldn't wait. He had a score to settle with them after what they had tried to do to them back then. The location where it would happen was unknown, but he was prepared and ready. Shortly after they had taken their late lunch break, the doors to the boardroom opened for the final time, and a tired-looking Max walked out. Ashley was a few steps behind him, a smug look on her face. "Dad is still in control," she whispered to Rip after giving him a quick kiss. Apparently, Fayez, the one the Arabs chose to sit on the board, lost something that had blackmail material on it yesterday. When he couldn't hand over the item to the various parties, instead of voting for him, they went with Dad. "We are still in control because of what you did last night. Thank you." Rip chuckled softly at the sheer luck involved with that. He had simply been taking everything he could. He had never expected there to actually be something useful on one of the devices. Who left something precious like that in their hotel room in the middle of an operation? The soldier guarding this Fayez fellow should have known better than that. You either always kept your valuable items on you, which was usually not realistic, or you stored them off-site. Most decent hotels had secure safes that only the manager had access to for this very reason. What about the Arabs? How did they take the news? He asked, his eyes already searching for their opponents. Not well. Fayez threw a fit like he was a 2-year-old little brat. It was rather impressive, really. He must have grown up with a gold spoon literally glued to his mouth. After that display, the board decided they would not even be offering him any sort of major discount either. He'll still get a small one since he is on the board, but that is it. Rip winced. Oh yeah. This idiot was going to be coming after them, and soon. Spoiled, angry, and with too much power were never good combinations. Fayez had the trifecta, along with access to a trained military force acting as his bodyguards. That thought brought him up short, as he finally asked a question he should have asked days before. Is Fayez royalty by any chance? Not everyone had access to the military, and the power to turn a squad into their personal bodyguards on a whim. Ashley shook her head. No, he's just really well connected, and this deal was that important to them. That was better than the alternative, but still not very good news for them. That meant that while Fayez could attack them with impunity due to his backing, if they did likewise, then there would be retribution. What it boiled down to was that when he took them out, he would need to do it carefully, and in a way that left no clear evidence behind. He couldn't trust the cleaners with this, except to possibly clean up parts of the site after he had already removed the bodies. Well shit. He scratched his chin. This is going to get messy, and I need to come up with a way to transport and get rid of all the bodies after I kill them. She nodded in understanding. Ashley had already come to a similar conclusion in regard to Fayez and what would happen if the man happened to die. She might not be an operative or trained in any way, but she had read plenty of books and could somewhat understand how things worked. At least if all the stories were even marginally correct. What do you need me to do? She asked as Fayez stomped toward the elevators with his guards in tow. Rip grinned and leaned toward her ear. Chapter 44. Using the drone, Rip kept his eyes on the people in the hotel suite while he prepared everything for later. Getting rid of bodies had never been a big part of his childhood. They had sort of just let them lie wherever they fell. However, since returning to the States, he had run through the occasional thought exercise on the matter of how he would dispose of a body and remove all traces of his involvement. It was something completely normal that all teenagers attempted at least once, and sometimes just the once. With the rise of serial police dramas, everyone wanted to believe that they were smarter than the law. It was simply that he might have attempted the thought exercise a few more times than might have been considered normal. It wasn't that he ever really intended to use it, but he also understood that the odds he would live a peaceful life were not good. The years he had gotten to live with Nathan and Ashley could already be considered a miracle, and now it was time to pay the piper for them. There was one thing that he was counting on going in his favor. He was able to choose where the location was and how the killing floor was designed. These people, with the possible exception of Fayez, would be coming to him because he had messed up their plans and the deal. There was absolutely no doubt in his mind that they wouldn't come seeking retribution for that. All he had to do was select a suitable location and then find a way to get rid of all the bodies without having them be traced back to him. It was thin. Undoubtedly, Fayez would have already reported Rip's involvement in the matter, which would make him a prime suspect when he disappeared. However, that was a matter for another time. There was only so much he could do with his current resources. If people wanted to come after him, then all he could do was be prepared. Luckily, Virginia had plenty of woods and other areas where he could choose from. Rip made sure Ashley was safe and secure in their apartment hours away from the family headquarters before he began. His truck was prepped, and Ashley was in the process of getting people to acquire the items for the final act. He had deliberately not told her what they would be used for, but she was a smart girl. She would figure it out. He just hoped she still looked at him the same way afterward when she did. He didn't know where the line in all of this was, and he didn't want to accidentally cross it and find out he had lost her or her respect. He could only hope that she would tell him when he was getting close to that point, and not after he had already crossed over it. It would depend on how important their relationship was to her, he supposed. For now, he needed to concentrate on what was about to happen. The tracker that had been attached to his truck when he came out earlier had been ridiculously easy to find. It was pretty much in plain sight, as if the Arabs were sending him a message. Luckily for them, it was limited to him alone. There had been nothing on either Ashley's or Max's cars. If there had been, he would have been forced to start the party early. Since it was clear they were coming for him alone, he had left the tracker in place. He had made sure Ashley knew what to do, and then he had begun his own preparations. They weren't coming for him right away. They had only wanted him to know that they would be coming and that he needed to prepare. So, that is exactly what he did. He prepared for them to come after him. The site had been selected beforehand. Now, it was simply a matter of waiting for them to arrive.